Hi, I'm Mike McGregor, and if you're asking yourself questions around your potential, around life, and around what you're capable of doing, so things like what is my potential, what am I capable of, and why am I not there already, and therefore what's perhaps in the way, or what is there to know or see or heal that I'm not aware of at this moment. Now these are great questions, and they're also big questions, but I'm hoping to be able to help with that at least a little bit. In the Potency Keys, I outline 9 keys that I use in my work and I've used in my own personal life. Most of the keys are entirely original. They're things that I've observed, noticed, and used. There are a couple in there that are the work of others that I've adapted and modified based on how I see the world and what my experience has been. And I trust that you'll find them all helpful in illuminating areas of life and yourself and just the world that we live in and how to make progress in it. And ultimately, how to live a life with more ease, more peace, more freedom, more clarity and expansion. And what I find is that when we invite those things into our life and create internal circumstances that are like that, our external world benefits as well. So things like our health and our wealth and our relationships, our lifestyle or life experiences, and ultimately our ability to contribute back to the world are enhanced. So it's interesting that doing this inner work actually leads to these external results. And that's one of the keys that I will share with you, which is around maybe the priority of goals that we hold. But I'll come to that a bit later. And in this video, I'll essentially step you through the 9 keys that I outline in the book. You may want to download the ebook as a companion to this information, but here I'll give you the high level via video. So we'll start with potential, and what is that? So it's my experience that we're all born with a seed of genius inside of us. And you can call it many things, it doesn't need to be called that necessarily, but the idea is that there's a set of instructions that we are actually gifted or born with, and those instructions basically are a roadmap to our potential. So what I'm talking about here are things like gifts and talents and abilities, skills. So those are things that we can do in the external world. I also believe that we're gifted with an inner potential as well. So again, those words, ease, peace, freedom, clarity, expansion. And under the right circumstances, we can grow fully into that potential. So that seed of genius is waiting for the right conditions so that it can grow. Now, wherever we are, what I find is there are usually reasons that we're not growing further. So another way of putting it is the right conditions are not present for our full growth. And just to amplify this concept a bit further, I think it's really helpful to look at nature for a lot of things. After all, we are nature and we are of nature, we're not separate. So it would make sense that the sort of processes we see in the world around us are also occurring in us. And maybe not exactly the same process, but we can definitely learn from what's happening. And the example I like to give is if you look at a tree which has seeds that it drops to the soil, for those seeds to grow, for them to activate the instructions that are already contained within them, we need the right conditions for that tree. If the seeds fall on rocky soil, we'll find that the seeds just won't grow. If they fall on shallow, sandy soil, we'll find that that tree will grow, but it'll be smaller. It might be formed in a different way or a different shape, but it certainly won't be fully activating the instructions that are inside of it. And lastly, if that tree falls on fertile soil with enough sun and enough rain, what we'll find is that tree has the maximum opportunity to reach its potential. So we're no different, and the way I see it, a lot of those conditions that we're talking about there for our growth are actually internal conditions. And where those things are not optimum are things like when we're carrying fear or resentment or frustration, shame, guilt, the list goes on. But all of those things are essentially restrictions that we hold internally. Now they may all come from different places, but in the end, when they're resolved, the energy that was consumed with that activity or that wound is actually released and given back to us, and we actually can grow more towards our potential. I want to talk about our human experience. And what I mean by that is, what's it like to be in here? Now, I'm leaning on the work of Michael Singer a little bit here. He talks a lot about this, about what's it like in there? What's the experience in here as you? How do you experience life? Now, depending on where you're at, you may be at the point where you realize that you're not your thoughts. So that's certainly the first step in separating who am I and what am I. You may also be at the point where you realize that you're not your body. We're in a body, but I'm not the body. And I have a body, but again, I'm not my body. So I'm not my thoughts, and I'm not my body. So what am I? I'll leave that for you to answer, but the way I see it is it's something else that's inside, occupying this body and experiencing these thoughts, and also experiencing the emotions and feelings and sensations. And there's a long list of words for that category as well. We've got things like intuition and other forms of energy that we can receive. But whatever we call them, and however many of those that we each accept as true or real, we're still in here having a human experience. So I think that's really important to look at, because if we're living in a house, if this is our home, well, what's it like in there? What is it actually like? How do I feel, and how do I experience life? And I would ask, what clutter have we accumulated that we can no longer see and we've actually come to accept? And again, these are those words like fear and shame and resentment and guilt and judgment. What I find is that things have happened to us on the journey to this point. So it might be cultural, it might be family, it might be events that have occurred, childhood or later. And each of those has essentially left a wound in us. And if those wounds aren't resolved, we end up walking around with them. We end up walking with a limp. We end up walking with splinters in our energetic or emotional body. And as the years get on, again, if they're not resolved, we carry that limp and we begin to accept it and we begin to forget about it. So back to this idea of the human experience and what's it like in here, if we have ways or tools to see freshly, how am I in here, what is happening, we can begin to make progress towards healing those wounds and freeing ourselves, essentially. So in one of the potency keys, I'll talk about goals, and I suggest that there might be two categories of goals: internal world goals, so how we feel, and external world goals, what we want or what we do perhaps. And I feel like the internal goals are really important, because if we begin to prioritize ease, freedom, clarity, peace, and expansion, we begin to clean up that mess. We begin to do things to see freshly what's happening in here, how am I? And I realize for a lot of people those things can feel maybe impossible or very old and therefore just not possible to make progress against, or very difficult to make progress. And some of them will be that, but equally, again, we live here. This is it. This is our one precious life that we're in. And if we want to clean up what's in here, it is possible. It requires courage and it requires a lot of work. And in some cases, it can take a long time, but it just depends on what you want from your life and how you want this human experience to be. Now, next, I want to talk about something that I call the impact cycle. And this is essentially a three-step cycle or three-step process. And the outcome of that is impact. Now, the reason that's important is it's possible to go through life without having an impact. An impact is defined as being able to make a difference or be able to influence something. So if we're having this human experience and we are setting internal and external goals, we need to be able to move towards that. And it's good to think about how we do that. It's good to maybe break down a little bit, what are the steps required to make progress in either of those areas? And there are many ways, but the way that I propose is this impact cycle. Now, the first step is around insight, meaning what is here? What is the truth about this situation, this person, this event, and more often than not, this feeling? What is the truth? Once we can see the truth, we can then design the second step, which is strategy. So now that I know the truth, now that I know where this is really coming from or what's really happening here, only then can I action or put in place a strategy to do something about it. if I haven't got the insight, if I don't know why I feel like that, I don't know why I do that, it's going to be impossible to actually put a strategy in place that's effective. So we have insight, and that's what the book largely, in my opinion, will help you with. It will provide some models, or it does provide some models, to demystify 9 different areas. And once you understand that landscape and reflect and maybe do some more work with it, your insight will deepen, and there will be layers to it. So it may not be an immediate clarity, but again, these tools will help you move forward. And once you've got that insight, you can then begin to apply strategies. And in many cases, the strategy is obvious when you have the insight, but equally there are areas, and personal development may be one of those, where it's still not clear. You might have identified why it's difficult to maybe you might people please. So why is it difficult for me to disappoint others? And you might identify an event where that happened as a child. So you might have that insight. Now I would say there's actually a deeper insight available. And that's something that maybe a coach or a counselor or some sort of other work, exploratory work to go deeper, can help you with. Once you've got the insight, you put in place a strategy. The strategy may require research. And once you've got that established, then we take action. Now, my experience is that insight's the most lacking. Strategy is probably often there, but if the insight's lacking, it doesn't really matter what the strategy is or how often it's there. It's going to be on poor foundations or poor soil. And lastly, the action. Now, I think action is probably what we do best in general. And if we think about our days, I think most of us would find that we are in action mode all day. So from waking to sleeping, most of us are actively doing something. It might be driving, talking, emailing, on our phone, watching something, but it's rare that we actually have a lot of space. So I don't think we need more action in most cases. I think what we need are better strategies that lead to more effective action with the action we're already taking. We're already filling our day. We can't do any more, but we can have that action aimed at something more precisely. And then the insight is the foundation of the whole cycle. I definitely see that insight is lacking, and clarity and more insight just makes that chain so much more powerful. When we get to the action step, there are some techniques required in order to put this in place. So my answer to that stage is, once you get there, act. So use your own word, but deliver, execute, act. But now's the moment to strike, and now's the moment to move forward. You've seen the truth about a situation, you've got a plan, now we need action. And at this point, you can go forward with full confidence. And what I like to say is, go until you vomit, or go until the insight has changed. And then we go back to peace and rest. We take a breath, we just look around and we reassess, and we develop the next insight about what's happening here. And that may require some time, but I think this mindfulness approach to insight, strategy, action leads to impact, but equally knowing that at the end of that, we then wait. We wait for the energy to come back. We wait for clarity on the next insight before we follow that chain. It just slows things down, and it also makes our energy a lot more focused and direct, and ultimately more impactful. All right, we're on to potency key number 1, which is your timeline. Now, there are 3 parts to this. There is your past, there is your present, and there is your future. Now, in reality, all that exists is the present. But I also find it really helpful to have these references around past, present, future, because it lets us focus our attention, and it's a language that we understand. But when it's all said and done, all there really is the present. And as I guide you through these, you'll hopefully see that a bit more clearly as well. Now, with your past, essentially there are wounds in our past, and we're all walking with a limp. Things have happened, and some of those things we may be aware of, we may know, we may remember. But I find the majority of these things are things that if somebody else mentioned to us, hey, do you remember that thing that happened at school? You might remember. You might go, oh yeah, I completely forgot that had happened. But your body hasn't forgotten, and your emotional system has not forgotten. And those events had an impact, and they shaped you. They shaped your behavior. In many cases, we developed survival strategies or coping strategies from that moment, from that event, that we are now still living as adults. And it's a little hard to separate them because they've been so close to us and so much a part of us for so long that if we sat here and asked ourselves, is there anything from my childhood? For a lot of people, the answer is not really. I think everything's okay. But where we find these in our lives is usually through behavior or outcomes that we don't want. So you may say, everything's okay, yet you might find at work you have trouble speaking up. Now, if we investigate that scenario at work, and especially in a coaching or counseling session, we dive into it. Well, how did you feel? And what were you thinking? And when has this happened before? And what does this remind you of? And which part of you was maybe, let's say, disabled or unable to speak up in that moment? Those sort of questions are gateway questions. And the answer to those questions leads us closer to the root of what's really going on here. And in particular with the parts. So this could be known as inner child work or internal family systems work. And essentially there we locate a part of ourselves that maybe sees something a certain way, feels a certain way, behaves a certain way. And once we can identify that there's a part there, we can actually do some really great work with that part to understand it, to understand its role, to bring resolution to that part so that it works better with the rest of you. Now, the work in all these areas never ends, and I guess in some ways that could be frustrating if your goal is for things to be finished and complete. But if you sort of begin to understand that things are a continuous evolution, your expansion is a continuous process with no end, you could begin to see the gifts that are there for you. So every time you resolve something, you unlock energy, you get a part of yourself back, and you unlock talent and gifts. So if the journey never ends, and every time I do that, I receive even more in return, you can begin to see that there's actually the potential for a lot of excitement here, because you actually have no limits. You are limitless. You are infinite. Now, in our years on Earth, we will reach a point where we no longer exist. So I guess there's a limit in that sense. But what we do between now and then is really entirely up to us without limits, based on our appetite, our love for life, our courage, and really defining what we want from this human experience. So to go back to the past, we're carrying these wounds, and these wounds are restricting us. They're limiting our potential, limiting our growth, as we saw earlier. These are conditions that are not optimal for us to grow fully. So what I say about the past is, let's heal what's there. And it may not be direct. It may be, as I mentioned earlier, through a situation at work or a situation at home that we then look into and work out where it comes from. But I would say 80 to 90% of your work probably rests here, even if it doesn't feel like it does. With the present, this is the only moment and the only place that exists, and we're always in the present moment. We're never in the past or in the future. And there's a real power to this present moment that many people have talked about, including Eckhart Tolle. And I don't know if I can explain it here and do it justice, but when you're fully present, you access all of yourself and you fully engage with life. And you're in the flow, and you're insightful and intuitive and powerful and creative. And we all spend time there, but we could all spend more time there, and what we'll find is it will be more powerful in our day-to-day life. If we skip forward to the future really is about the vision that we want to bring into being. So what is the vision that you have for your life? And to give you some structure around that, I propose internal and external worlds. And to rattle those off, on the internal world, the way I see it, and you can define it however you like, but I've found 5 areas feel pretty universal. There's peace, clarity, expansion, freedom, and impact. Now, if we focus on those 5 areas, we can extrapolate those forward and build a vision of the life that we want for our internal world. So what degree of those things do I want to experience? Where am I at the moment? What's in the way? What's in the way of me experiencing more peace in my life? So around the future, around setting our vision, I encourage us to focus on the internal world. Of course, there's the external world that we all want as well. And the way I see that world is health and wealth and relationships and lifestyle or life experiences, and lastly, contribution. How do we give back and who do we give back to? So around the future, it's around setting this vision and working out what needs to happen in order to get there. And you could link back to the impact cycle here again around insight, strategy, and then action. So that's the way I see our timeline, and I find it a really helpful framework to use. So with the past, we heal it. With the present, we inhabit it or embody it. And with the future, we envision it and we build it. Now, potency key number 2, we've already touched on briefly earlier, but I'll just go through it again here, and maybe there's something different that's helpful. So this is our seed of genius. This is our gift, and depending on your beliefs and view of the world, there are different labels for it. But it is absolutely my direct experience with myself and through my work that we are absolutely given a gift, and we're given, I'll call them a set of instructions, but it's more a set of potentials that we could grow into. And there are no labels for any of this, but because we're talking about it, that's where these frameworks and labels and names come in so that we can have a conversation about it. But I want to emphasize that all of this is organic and natural, and nature doesn't come with labels. The rainbow doesn't come with names for the colors, and even the colors in the rainbow. If you look at a rainbow and you ask someone how many colors there are, a lot of people will say there are 7 colors in the rainbow. And I don't know whether you're aware of this, but I mean, that actually isn't true. There actually is an infinite number of colors in the rainbow. So we might look at it and say there's 7 for the ease of conversation, but it's not actually true. If we were to take each of those colors and zoom in on the rainbow, we would notice there's this spectrum. And when we zoom in on the spectrum, when we think we've identified colors and we zoom in, again, there's another spectrum. And the increments are infinitely smaller and smaller, but they never end. So I just give you that example as an example of how nature works. Nature generally doesn't have barriers, and it certainly doesn't have labels. So when we're talking about all these things, we are talking about nature, and it's probably mostly not actually true what we're saying. We just need to box it so that we can put a name or a word on it so that we can have a conversation. But I encourage you to find your own direct experience with all these things. So going back to the seed of genius, we receive these potentials, these gifts, these skills, these talents, this inner experience that we're capable of receiving or having. And again, peace, freedom, expansion, clarity. And our seed of genius needs the right conditions to fully occupy that space and embody those traits. So I encourage you to begin to understand or continue your journey understanding what are the conditions that you need. And the conditions will often change as we evolve. What was right for me and healthy for me 2 years ago is not healthy for me now, perhaps. And now there's a new level of distinction or discernment required in where I spend my time or who I spend my time with and what I need to nourish myself. So this is another one of those processes that is constantly evolving, but it gets easier once we know how to listen and how to inquire. And that's where things like meditation and reflection time come in, because they can provide the space to simply be with your seed of genius and understand what the conditions are needed at this moment so that you can move forward. All right, this is probably my favorite of the potency keys, if I'm honest. This is number 3, and this is the iceberg of self. Now, the iceberg of self, if you've got the ebook, it might be helpful to have it nearby so you can follow visually. But the iceberg of self is essentially an iceberg with a waterline and then 80% of the iceberg under the surface. And if we start from the top of the iceberg, what we've got there are our results, what we see in the world and what we see in our life. Now, this is generally external. So this is things like if you take your phone and you look at your photo reel, that's your results. So that's who you spend time with and where you go and what you have and what you've done. And there can be other categories that you can add to that as well. But essentially, it's the things that if you look around, you see in your life, and all those things are the result of something that you've done. So if we go from results, the results are coming from the behavior that you've taken. And essentially, it's all the things that you do and you say. So the emails that you send, the meetings that you go to, the things that you build with your hands. And saying is the words that you speak. So the things that you say to your partner at home, the things you say perhaps to your children or your parents, the things you say to your colleagues or the person at the cafe. All those things you do and all those things that you say result in what you see in your world and your results. Now, when we don't get the results that we want, a lot of us look to do and say things differently. Or maybe I should have said this, maybe I should have said that, maybe I should have done this, maybe I shouldn't have got angry. And that's valid. That is certainly a point or a line of inquiry. But what I see is that before that, there comes something else. So maybe I shouldn't have got angry, or maybe I shouldn't have said that. Next time I won't do it. You can certainly try that, but there's a reason that you got angry, and there's a reason that you said that. And there are ways to inquire into that. And what we do there is if we've got the waterline with the iceberg, we now go below the surface. So this is now the invisible world. And the very first thing that we find in our invisible world is our human experience. So how I feel, what I think, what I can sense. And there are, again, a lot of labels in this world. Intuition comes into play here, energy comes into play here. And this whole world drives what we do and what we say. So we feel angry, and then we act angry, and then we get a result that we don't want. And rather than just trying to stop the behavior, I encourage us to go under the surface and be with the anger directly and understand the anger, see where it comes from, what is the wound that's present here, and take some steps towards resolving that. Now, this system's interesting. There are two more levels below the human experience level, what we feel, sense, and think. And the deeper we go, the more impactful the energy that we spend or the change that we make is. So at the results level, if you try and change your results, you actually can't. If you try and change what you do and say, you can make some progress in that area, but you'll find that you're working against something. There's a current or a pressure coming in that's still trying to do the original thing. Still, the anger's still there. You haven't resolved it. So that's valid in some cases, techniques and maybe reminders and strategies. But at that next level down into the invisible world, what I feel, sense, and think, that's where a lot of the gold is. And the changes we make there automatically move upstream. And this is what I think is the beautiful thing about self-development work and healing our wounds, is some things almost become effortless. We don't have to remember not to get angry or not to get irritated, not to be upset, not to talk so sharply to someone, because it's simply not there anymore. It's gone, or at the very least, it's reduced. So we've got the results, our behavior, and then we've got what we experience. Now, below that is something else, which is what we hold. And this is the realm of our wounds. So these are the lies that we tell ourselves. I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. And often those lies started as lies that somebody else said to us. And they said that to us because of what was happening inside of them. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And even if it is true, we don't need to carry it. And chances are that the person that they said it to was a different person a long time ago. So we're generally walking around carrying baggage. And again, things that happened in the past are no longer here because it was a previous present moment. But if they're affecting us, the only person responsible for that at this point is us. We're still carrying that. We're still holding that hurt or that resentment. And in theory, or in truth, we can let go of that at any point in time. But that doesn't mean that it's easy to do that. But equally, it doesn't mean that it's not possible. So at this level, what I encourage us to do is to become aware of the things that we're holding, because those things that we're holding affect the experience that we have, and the experience that we have affects above the surface the things that we do and say, and they affect the results. So at this fourth level, the work is really powerful. A small change here works up the system automatically. And what we'll find is the system is really robust. At the top, you try and poke and make changes, and almost nothing happens, and a lot of energy is spent. But as we go down, the effort is arguably less, but the impact is dramatically greater. Now, the last level, the fifth level down, is essentially who you are. And this would go back to that seed of genius that we were talking about earlier. This is your root, your true self, your core. You could call this your soul, your eternal essence. This is the very heart of you, and this is the thing having a human experience inside of you. Now, the information from here flows up, and it hits firstly the things that we hold, and those are constrictions: fear, resentment, anger, judgment, guilt, shame. And that distorts the message and the information coming from our true self. And as we can see, it then goes upwards through the chain. So my personal view on reaching our fullest potential is actually clearing the access to a true self through resolving the restrictions and the wounds that are in the way. And with less and less effort, we actually become greater and greater and freer and freer. Okay, potency key number 4. Now, these are the stages of potency. And again, this is of nature. There are no stages, there are no divisions, there are no labels. But for the benefit of a conversation and understanding, I have looked at that process, and I believe there are 4 key phases to that process of accessing our fullest potency. The first one here is the individual stage. And this is where everything is about me. And I can still remember, it actually wasn't that long ago when this was the realm that I was coming out of. And I remember walking to yoga one day, I think maybe 6 years ago at this point, and suddenly I stopped and I just had this clarity that every single thought that I was having was about myself. What do I want? How do I feel? What am I going to eat? What am I going to do after yoga? What am I going to do tomorrow? Why hasn't this person responded to me? And it actually made me feel sick, because all I heard and could see for the first time was me, 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 me. Now, looking back, I didn't know what was happening at the time, but looking back, I was coming out of this first stage of the individual. And in that first stage, it is very egocentric. And it's not bad. I wasn't bad. I guess you could say some of the actions maybe would look selfish because it was centered or self-centered, but it wasn't through any bad intent. It was all I knew, and it was just a result of what had happened and what I hadn't yet resolved. But the fact that I was coming out of it and could see that as it was happening was a sign of growth. And I remember it being quite exciting after it was a bit sickening to suddenly just see that so clearly and have a little bit of distance from it. So in that first stage, we're not asking about anybody else. We're not asking to help others or support others or even really maybe notice others. It's all about ourselves. The second stage is what I call the initiation stage. And this is our first exposure to maybe emotions and energy and feelings. And there's a whole massive world here of things that we might encounter and might try. This is a bit of an exploration stage. This might be when we first think, I might try yoga, I might try meditation. And this is sort of a call on the journey of evolution to understand ourselves better and more deeply. So this is a really exciting stage, but it can be confusing because all of a sudden things are potentially a bit more complicated, especially at first. And we're in contact with maybe old emotions that we previously had disconnected from. So it can be a disorientating stage to move through. And what we'll outline later is that each of these stages has gifts. So I outline those in the ebook. It might be a bit easier to read them there rather than me sharing them here. Stage number 3 is maturation. And this is where we take that healing journey a lot further. And at this point, we've actually resolved a lot of our healing. Not all of it, there is always more. But in particular, I would say almost the emergencies the fire's out. The crisis is over. We've moved from essentially a healing journey in the previous stage to now more of an expansion journey. And there's a transition. It's not quite as black and white as that. But this is a more advanced stage of our healing journey We know our way around our emotions. We are familiar with meditation. We're familiar with mindfulness. We have probably got several years of this work under our belt at this point. And lastly, the very last stage is what I call full potency. Now, here we are reaching or approaching mastery. We have got energetic hygiene practices. We know how to self-regulate and self-soothe our nervous system. And at this point, we'll begin to potentially have spiritual experiences and be aware of things such as our intuition and possibly taking steps to develop those. Now, at this point, we reach sort of an exponential power. We are very precise, very impactful. We can do a lot in a short period of time because we can see what matters and what doesn't, and we focus on what matters and what aligns. We are discerning with our energy and our time, and in general, this is someone that you might look at as a clear leader, a really impactful person, and someone that you might admire through their presence and their charisma. Now, that idea of leadership, I believe we're all leaders once we move out of that first stage. Once we move out of the first stage, we begin asking, how can I help, and what can I build, and what do you need? And those questions get louder as we move through to the fourth stage. I want to share with you potency key number 5, which is what I call the pyramid of life. You could say there are some parallels to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but I see this quite differently, so I'll take you through it. Essentially, the pyramid has 4 levels, and we'll start from the bottom, from the foundation and the base of the pyramid. And that base level is essentially a need for safety and our survival level. And this has whatever it is that you need to survive, but the things that I list are food, so nutrition, and a healthy body, so I would put exercise in here, physical safety, community, and anything else that is really critical for your survival. If we don't have those in place, we simply can't progress further. We're constantly in crisis mode, and our foundation is not stable. So occasionally I'll talk to people that are maybe at the next couple of stages in some areas, but they're feeling held back. They just don't know why they can't move further. And when we investigate, often this is the level where something's missing, something basic, something foundational, maybe is a better word for it. Once we've moved out of that survival mode, we move into healing. And I guess one way to look at this is if you're in an emergency, all the energy and resources are diverted to putting the fire out. Only once the fire is out can we start to do anything else. And in the second level, moving up, the healing phase, we've got some safety, we've got some stability in our lives, and our body is in good condition. Now we can begin to resolve the wounds of the past, and we can begin to investigate some of the things that we've been talking about already around healing and trauma and past events and family and cultural wounding as well. Now, I think this is a really exciting stage because from here things begin to speed up quite quickly, and we might spend a lot of our lives in these first couple of stages, but don't let that put you off, because there are no limits to this journey and this progress that you're making, and things actually accelerate exponentially the further you move up the pyramid. Third stage, third level, is that of growth. So the fire is out, we've done a lot of the healing, now we move into more of an expansion phase where we begin to apply our gifts and develop our talents, and we begin to get a reward from those, and the skills and the talents and the gifts begin to develop quite quickly, and we begin to offer them out into the world. So I find the excitement builds as we move up this pyramid. This is a really exciting place to be. At the fourth level, the top of the pyramid is coherence. And this could be likened to the fourth stage of the potency stages. This is a limitless, full potential stage where we access all of our gifts, and our progress really amplifies or moves forward exponentially at this point. I'll leave the details for the ebook. This one's a bit longer to outline, but have a look at the images in the ebook. Okay, so I just want to share with you key number 6, which is our nervous system. So again, this one's quite visual. You're probably best to look at the ebook, but I'll give you the verbal summary here. We've got a nervous system in our body, and that nervous system experiences reality based on what it senses. Now, sometimes what it's picking up on is what we might call a real threat. So maybe it's a physical life or death situation, but also sometimes there are memories from the past and the body responds in a way that indicates a threat, when if we're able to look at it maybe impartially, we might notice that actually there really isn't a threat there, it's more of a perceived threat. And what I mean by that is, let's say, use a work example, let's say you've got an important meeting tomorrow, maybe it's an interview, and you have trouble sleeping that night, and you're perhaps feeling anxious in the morning. Now, a lot of us would think that's normal when I say that it is, but also that is a heightened response. That's actually a fear or threat response that we're experiencing at that point. Now, depends on what you want to do about that, but you may be able to investigate, well, where is that coming from? Well, I have a belief that I'm not good enough. I have a belief that I'm an imposter and I actually am not capable of this job or even the job that I have at the moment. Now, if that's what was happening inside, you may want to, or you can do work on that if you want to, so that you no longer feel that way in those situations. That's an example of your nervous system being activated based on a past experience rather than necessarily the reality that's happening in front of you. Now, there are 3 key levels to your nervous system activation. There's essentially a mode where we're connected and we're peaceful and we're at ease, and that's the feeling of safety. And that's where we are when we're at home with our partner, when we're maybe laying in on a Sunday morning in bed, or just doing something else that we really enjoy when we feel relaxed. That's our natural state. Now, we move out of that when we sense a threat. And the first set of defenses that we have against that threat is fight or flight, that we've all heard of. Fight is a response where we move towards the threat. So this might be something aggressive such as rage or anger. And then flight is where we move away from the threat. And this might be something like fear or worry or anxiety. So already it can be interesting just to make a note of what I've just mentioned, because if I'm feeling, let's say, frustration, I might accept that as normal. But if I understand the nervous system, and I've had this with myself, I've learned that actually it is normal, but also when I'm feeling frustrated, I've actually got my nervous system activated. This is not calm and connected and safe. Something is unsafe and I'm feeling frustrated. So knowing the words or the emotions that go with these states can help us understand that we are actually in an activated state. And once we know that, we can begin to investigate why that might be. And over time, we can increase our what we call the window of tolerance, which is the zone that we feel safe within. So if a certain situation activates us into fight or flight, over time, we can develop this window so that that situation no longer activates the same response. So we've got our window of tolerance and an area that we feel safe. We've got an event that presents as a threat, and in that range is where we feel those emotions, anxiety, frustration, fear, and worry. Now, if that action that we're taking, because at that point we believe, or our body believes, that we can do something about this, I'm going to fight it or I'm going to flight it, I'm going to run away from it. The body believes it's capable of resolving the situation through those actions. If things get worse and we can't resolve it, we actually reach a life or death, life threat state. And at this point, we begin to shut down. And this is things like hopelessness or numbing or depression, amongst other things. Now, in this area, we have gone from green, everything's okay, to an alert, there's a danger, there's a threat, to now literally a life or death response in our body. I'll let you look at the ebook for the rest of the explanation, and in particular the visual, so you can understand what I'm getting at here. But maybe this verbal summary helps a little bit in terms of just learning what's going on in here. And it's very powerful. You can use it to begin to identify what it is that brings you back down and deactivates you or soothes you. And I would encourage you to make a list of the things that you already know about that allow you to soothe yourself. So if you're feeling fear or anger or frustration, what do you already know that helps you come out of that? Is it going for a walk? Is it talking to a friend? Is it going to yoga? Now, those things on the surface can sound a little lacking in power, but the reality is that your nervous system is activated, and those things do work in terms of helping you feel safe and deactivate. And longer term, you may want to investigate, well, why do I feel fear or frustration in those situations? And I can promise you that you can make progress in those areas. It's just a case of making space and time. All right, potency key number 7. Now, this is the journey of ascension. And this is essentially about raising our vibration and our frequency as a being. Now, that can sound very abstract. And what does that mean? How does that work? Essentially, it's a journey of moving from full alignment to fear to full alignment to love. And I lean on the work of Dr. Hawkins here, who through a number of experiments identified a consciousness scale moving from shame through to enlightenment, or I call it peace. And he did a number of experiments that gave a hierarchy of these emotions and the energy or the frequency that they each represent. I've added to it by identifying 6 stages of our relationship to fear and love, starting with fear. And I'll leave it for the ebook for you to have a look at, because you can read through there and see the visuals a bit more clearly. But for the moment, just know that there is a journey to be made, and we actually don't do it in one part. We do it in many parts, and we contain many parts. And my experience is that as we do our healing work, we naturally move up this ladder of ascension. But there's also an ongoing process of finding new parts that we left behind. So let's say we're doing pretty well and we're feeling pretty happy in life. We might identify that there is a part of us that just feels inadequate all the time, always, and it causes us to do or to act out in certain ways. I would say that's a part that's stuck at a lower rung on the ladder, the ascension ladder, and we can actually go back. Once we locate that part, we can go back and we can help bring it up the ladder from fully in fear to 6 stages to full alignment with love. And as we go back and we bring back each of these parts, the collective of us also ascends. Potency key number 8 is Plutchik's emotion wheel. Now, if you haven't seen this before, it's basically a map of our core emotions or key emotions. There are actually thousands of emotions that have been identified through research. This particular model has a much smaller number, and it lays them out so that you can begin to see a map of the most common emotions that humans experience. And there's a lot you can do with that. You can ask yourself questions such as, which of these do I experience the most? Which are most present in my life? Which are least familiar? And for example, you might notice joy, and you might ask yourself, how often do I experience joy? And you might discover that it's not as often as you like. Now we have an area of focus. Now we can make progress towards experiencing more joy. Equally, one that I've used personally is I remember seeing frustration on there. And it occurred to me how frequently I experience frustration. And that led me to realize that wasn't necessarily how I wanted to feel. And I began to investigate, well, what is frustration and why do I experience it? And for me, it was essentially, or it is essentially, a denial of the reality that's in front of us. So I was disagreeing with the reality that I was in. There was tension between the way I wanted things to be and the way they were. And it's very hard to make progress if we don't accept things with the way they are. It's also very hard to be at ease if we're at odds with what's present. So you can use this wheel in a number of ways, but essentially have a look at the map of emotions, ask yourself questions, see what you notice. In the ebook, I've also correlated these emotions with the nervous system that we mentioned earlier. So the emotions that we feel when we're in safety, I've colored as green. And those when there's a threat response and we're in fight or flight, I've colored as yellow. And those when we reach a life or death or life threat situation, I've colored as red. And you might use them that way to ask yourself questions when you reach those states. So when you feel fear or frustration, you can recognize that you're in an activated state, and you can be a bit more mindful about that state. And whether it's then or later, you can begin to inquire as to what put you into that state. And as we've seen all the way through the book so far, you can begin to make progress to locate the root. All right, and we're on to the last of the potency keys, potency key number 9, which is the wheels of life. Now, many of us have heard of the wheel of life if we've done any coaching or self-development work. And just to explain what that is briefly, imagine a wheel or a circle, and divide the circle up into, there's all sorts of models out there, 3 parts, 5 parts, 9 parts, 10. I like 5 personally, so we can remember what the things are that we're focusing on. So take the wheel, divide it into, let's say, 5 equal parts, and label each of those with something that you want from your life. So you might ask yourself, how do I view my life holistically? My approach to this with the external world is health, wealth, relationships, lifestyle, and contribution. So you would label the circle with those 5 labels, and you would then mark, starting from the middle moving out, you would mark where you feel you currently are in those areas. So if your wealth is, let's say, 50% of where you would like it to be, you would mark halfway out on the circle. Once you've done that with all 5 areas, you connect the dots and you end up with a shape. Now, the wheel part of this name comes from that shape. If you now imagine that that was a wheel and that was rolling forward, how well would it roll? And the intention behind this is to seek balance. So we might have strong wealth, strong health, poor relationships, let's say strong lifestyle, but maybe no contribution. That wheel's going to be quite lumpy and quite bouncy. So the encouragement or the insight from that would be to invest more in those areas that are lacking so that you have a balanced life. And you can still work at expanding that circle, but you can deal with the gaps that are in it at that time. So that's the wheel of life as it normally is used. I find it helpful to have an internal wheel and an external wheel. And the internal wheel has things like peace, clarity, freedom, expansion. And the external wheel has those things I mentioned earlier: health, wealth, relationships, lifestyle, and contribution. And you can use your own labels. What I find is when we set these inner goals and we begin to assess where we are internally in these areas, we make progress. And with the inner goals, we just experience, or we have a better experience in our human experience. So we're happier. And things are more easeful. And I guess within that is also less energy required, less fighting, less stress, essentially. And when we embody those traits, ease, peace, freedom, clarity, expansion, what we find is our external world benefits immediately, and benefits more than if we just tried to accumulate more money or just tried to have a better relationship. If we show up differently, we just get different results. So in Potency Key number 9, I share with you the 2 wheels and an encouragement to make the internal world your priority and still hold the external goals, but let's not make those everything without a focus on the internal world. Okay, so that's the 9 potency keys summarized. If you haven't already downloaded the ebook and you feel like this is helpful for you, I encourage you to. And what it'll do is it'll give you the visual models that I've been waving my arms about on this video, and just help you see and understand in more detail these concepts. If you're feeling that there's something here for you to work with me, there is an open invitation. You're welcome to book an exploration call or send me a message. In your exploration call, the purpose of that really is just to check our fit and our alignment, for me to hear a bit about where you're at, where you want to get to, where you see yourself in 90 days and beyond, and what help you think you need or what support you need, and equally for me to share with you perhaps how I can help in that direction.